The Secret Game by Kent J. Starrett. Read for you by the author. Christmas time is an odd time for the secret game. Of course, any time of year is truly atypical for the secret game. It is so rarely played that its occurrence is itself incomparable. But Christmas is often a time when the mind wanders to other matters. Family, perhaps. Turmoil inevitably results from the stresses of feigning love with material things, frustration with seeing people one avoids all year round, or, for the lucky few, brief highs of nostalgia and appreciation of the kinds of connections one normally gives no conscious thought. Loving parents, happy children. And, for both those engaged in the secret game and the vast majority unaware, religious significance and a connection to something infinitely greater than they can ever hope to grasp. And thus, Ghost had come to play the secret game. She was one of very few girls ever to do so, and the first in memory ever to do so in the winter. Ghost discovered it by accident. Cursed with the bitter-tasting name of Trisha, Ghost was what everyone called her, for her deathly, sickly complexion. Variants, such as the Walking Dead or the Crypt Keeper, were never far behind. As long as it wasn't her full name, which was so often screamed at her by other kids seeking to jangle her nerves and shred her self-esteem, she could accept it. Life is so often about accepting the unacceptable, isn't it? Trisha was a little over 15 when she first began to play the secret game. She had moved into Old Haven 3 years earlier, with 2 amazing novelties that made her a figure of great wonder, and one that made her an untouchable. One of her amazing novelties was that her parents were less or more happy, not even showing the slightest signs of divorce. This was something keen-eyed and sharp-witted kids like Bryce Harlow chalked up to her being an only child. The fightin' wears 'em down, makes 'em weak. Soon they're playing favorites or going crazy, he'd said. The other was her running skill, something that put her on the track team and almost sent her straight to the top, had the 3 hormone-charged Amazons in the top spots not hazed and tortured her to keep her down. She was neither short nor tall for her age, and her legs were long and lanky, and they could run without stopping for nearly an hour. Sometimes they shook in the night and woke her up, so it could be said they couldn't go without walking somewhere for more than an hour tops. Her feature of derision was a lisp, and a stutter aggravated by a retainer. This was something that made the rumors of her mental retardation fly like a locust swarm across the school's meanest kids. Spitballs and vulgar graffiti in the bathrooms and on her locker were now a weekly occurrence. Trisha's waist-length copper-colored hair was being tugged whenever she took her eyes off it. She was too proud to cut it, so she only glared and muttered something back. This was the only time she'd ever been forced to swear, but in time, it eventually comes as naturally as a new language one hears in a foreign country they've lived in for a while. Tough to live with, but when that's life, there's no choice. She'd found out about the game by accident, which was rare indeed. She didn't know, then, that she'd become ensnared in something that would go on for the rest of her life and all of eternity afterwards. But nobody involved ever really did. Save, of course, those who struck first and began the game.
That was long ago, and far away. This was very recent, and very near. It occurred to her when she saw it, painted into the side of a shopping mall. Here she often stopped after school to eat, study, and mostly escape the torment and boredom of school's grueling, wasted days. Whether it had been left for her to find intentionally, or for nobody in particular, is hard to say. We can't really begin to understand why they do what they do. We can only let them do it, and hope we don't suffer for what ensues. But Trisha found it, and now the game had begun anew. She caught it for perhaps a few seconds, maybe less. It wasn't a long gaze, but she examined it for the brief time it was before her. It was long enough to leave a lasting impression, though she didn't know it yet. It looked something like a moth, or a harsh, red butterfly, at least at first glance. But a second's worth of gazing earned a universe more of detail, features that burned themselves into Trisha's brain with the same scorching intensity of the thing's cross-eyed, broken-toothed glare. In the December cold, Trisha suddenly broke into a heated sweat, as if the image radiated the heat of a second sun, smaller but no less roaring with flames, transported right here, into this image painted into the mole's frigid granite walls. It was humanoid, in some shape or another. The drawing was almost 18 feet tall, but most of its length was elongate neck and bloated torso. Painted with something like vivid pastels, the stomach region was light blue, veiny and distended, as if the thing were dying of parasites, like a sick, bloated cat.
Its legs were short, stubby, and more elephantine than human, though its arms and face gave away a level of pain and hungry obsession that only the human animal seemed to have mastered. Its eyes bulged and stared in two different directions, and its teeth were so oversized that it must have been painful to eat. It held things in its two hands, but Trisha couldn't identify them. They might have been tools, sacks, or animal carcasses. Were Trisha somewhat more morbidly inclined, or more distanced from what she and everyone else called reality, she might have stared longer. But this was not to be. Instead, Trisha unzipped her jacket, hoping for a cold, bitter wind to wash off the sudden dirtiness she felt creeping across her skin like those red centipedes. Shaking her head and humming a song to try and drown out the unease, she walked home. As she walked, she noticed the wind was less chilling and more numbing. Was that the right word? A tingling feeling seemed to radiate out of her bones, as if her whole body was falling asleep. She tried to ignore it, tried to banish the sluggish sickness from her arms and legs, and kept walking home, wondering the whole way why she did not feel any colder than she was. Trisha arrived home to an empty house, as she had done every day since she began walking home from school when she was 9. This empty house held a 3-foot plastic tree that could flash red and yellow lights when plugged in, which didn't alter its fundamental makeup in any significant way. The same white wall stood, barren and blank, and the same love seat sat across from a curtainless window that gazed out into the open street in front of her house. Beyond that, the woods of rural Ohio stretched even further. Trisha shook, stifled. She threw off her jacket, falling to her knees against the scratchy, white carpet. This same barren house where she'd lived for 15 years now felt like a prison cell in a jungle somewhere. "I think I might sleep outside," Trisha said. She almost never talked to herself, even when alone. Silence can be as oppressive as any chain, and what feeble power her warbling infant's voice had was put to immediate use. She slept outside in the summer, a quirk she developed in childhood and pretended to outgrow only in the colder months. Reclining in a lawn chair on the porch under a mosquito net,
They were the most peaceful, dreamless rests she'd ever had. Now, swept by a strange tropical heat in the middle of the coldest month of the year, she thought she might revive it. Until she could see a doctor, at least. She took a deep breath. Something like burning meat and cigar ashes reached her nose, and she gagged hideously. She rushed to the kitchen, coughing and choking like a plague victim. Her head was numb, her eyes sore, like she'd stared straight at the sun for 12 whole minutes, even if the sun was barely out that day. Slamming the cabinet door, she tore out a glass and poured some water from the tap. She downed it instantly, though room temperature water always made her nauseous, and got another, and another. Though she collapsed to the kitchen floor, toenails scraping against the tiles, it barely registered. She felt it still, the humidity smothering her like a wet blanket, the sense of those centipede legs shuddering up and down her flesh, and worst of all, a throbbing noise in her head. The fluorescent kitchen lights gnawed her eyes like ticks, and the creaking walls sounded like steel bending beneath the weight of Jupiter. Trisha went to her room, exhausted from a fight she hadn't fought, and opened both of her windows. At some point, tangled in her unmade sheets, and feeling like she'd run 20 miles to get home instead of walking 4, she fell into a deep, deep slumber. Somewhere far away, something stirred. Its intense, as cold as the bitter wind and as steaming as the mists of the Amazon, began to converge on its target. And if it might have been said to smile, it smiled then. Years ago, Trisha was a little girl, as many humans are at some point or another. Her grandparents had a house in South Carolina where her and her parents would drive down to visit before the grandparents died in a car accident when she was 10. Her parents told her they moved to Gibraltar, and they never drove back to South Carolina ever again. She had always complained that North Carolina smelled like rotten eggs whenever they drove through, but when she realized she would never go back to the stilted beach house in the South, she cried all night until the sun rose the next day. Mom cried with her, though it would be a long time before Trisha discovered exactly why. Memories sometimes came to her in dreams, and she welcomed them. One night, which was coincidentally the night they were supposed to go back to Ohio, there had been a terrible flood. Trisha thanked God at the time, as she'd prayed to stay with Grandma and Grandpa for just one more day. While her parents sat around smoking and wondering how much work they'd miss while stuck there, Trisha bounced around like a little nymph having a tea party with Grandma and her antique stuffed animals. The South Carolina house had weathered enough of them that there was no danger, but the only flood Trisha ever experienced was both traumatizing and hypnotic in its sheer, awesome power. In both her real life and the dream she was locked in, she'd been woken up from the booming rain. It had been 7 years, but the booming rain still roared as loud and clear as if it were trying to wake her up all over again. Little Trisha got up and wandered into the hall, thinking it was time to get up. She didn't know where everyone else was sleeping, and was visibly confused by the bizarre absence of sunlight and terminal thirst for Grandpa's homemade orange juice. Or rather, she would have been visibly confused if there was any light to see her expression by. She stumbled forward on the cold wood floors and stood in the living room, weary and drowsy and feeling not quite herself. It was a feeling she would become very well acquainted with over the rest of her life, but now it was strange and scary, a tingling chill that crawled up her spine and rested in her mind, painting the room around her aglow with movement. Familiar floral drapes shuddered, the force of the rain shaking the walls. Trisha dared not move her head, or move anything at all. She stood still as a statue, something children rarely do. Even her eyes moved slowly up to the blackened skylights in the roof. Rivulets of water ran down the panes, illuminating nothing in the skies above. Yet the water seemed to trickle down in a pattern, on one of the panes at least. It seemed like something was forming there, something black as the sky above, pressed against the glass. The rain flowed past it, shaping its outline as if driven away from it by some form of magnetism. Trisha focused harder, hearing it press against the pane. Creaking, like it was about to shatter the glass and break through. She focused as much as she could in the dim, rainy night, and thought she could make out the shape of a hand. A huge, bloated hand, like the palm of a malformed giant. This is where the dream diverged from her memory. This is where everything changed. The hand was gone. Swiftly, she heard it creak against the glass. And then the creaking came from the side of the house, something pressing up against it. Trisha listened for a long time, unsure of what to do. She walked slowly, the whole house growing like an open valley, her footsteps echoing as loud as gunshots in this impregnable mausoleum. When the drapes were there at her stubby fingertips, they felt like skin, writhing, slithering against her hands, as if moving aside by their own inanimate resolve. When she saw what was outside the window, there was an infinite instant between its eyes meeting hers, and yet another in between eye lock and the endless scream that rose so high, it shattered the skylights and the sky above them. What stood outside had not been there before. In all past recollection of this innocent moment, she had simply turned around and gone back to bed. Now, this memory was infected, violated by something she could understand neither then nor now. When she awoke, screaming so hard she felt like her throat had been shredded with razor blades, the thing's image was burned into her brain forever. The game had begun anew, and already Trisha was losing.
"Yes, I need to report an absence," Trisha's mother said in the other room. Her voice sounded like rattling tin through Trisha's door, something from the same world that thing had come from. A bucket for vomit sat by her bed, since her mother was convinced she was suffering from some sort of biological ailment. A fever dream, she said it was, though Trisha had no fever to speak of. Her mother, a weary old woman whom life had ground down to a feeble scarecrow, tried to console her by touching her shoulder. Up until today, her 15-year-old daughter had entertained this. Today, Mom's weak and weary hands made her scream again, as if they were hands not human. "She's very, very sick,"
her mother quavered to the phone. Trish had seen the look her mother gave her when she'd screamed bloody murder. Her mother's gray eyes grew wide, her mouth agape. It looked as if she would cry for the first time since her parents spontaneously moved to Gibraltar. For an instant, endless as the one in her dream, her mother's eyes grew wide enough to engulf her whole face. Her open mouth seemed to stretch back to her ears, which suddenly sank from sight in her pale, rounded face. Hair uncombed in the early morning light suddenly looked wild and tangled like jungle creepers, and her nose shrank back to become the nostrils of an open skull, set beneath those owl's eyes and above a black, toothless, parasite mouth. For an instant, Trisha lay there, limp-limbed and numb,
After her mother went to kiss her on the forehead, thought better of it, and then solemnly left for work, Trisha made a full jug of green tea and set about drinking the whole thing. Sickness be damned. A typical thing, that. She never liked tea before. She sipped it hesitantly, grimacing, and then drinking anyways, trying to get it over with. One of the girls on the track team used to say that green tea was like coffee, but with none of the health defects. That, and the fact that it was the only thing in the house to keep her awake, kept her drinking it until her stomach roiled and practically shrieked at her like a vivisected bird. In the living room, she looked at the tree, plastic and glowing without warmth of any kind. Outside, a storm had come. Frozen rain pelting the windows, rollicking the barren trees, and battering the already formidable sheets of snow. Trisha went over and closed all the blinds, because she didn't want anything peering in at her. And so it was only the tree, its pale yellow lights the only thing she could see. The thing in the dream hadn't appeared to her when she was a child, alone in the South Carolina house and, for a little while, totally alone in the world. It was something her mind had given birth to. No. Her mind snapped at her, blasphemed. No matter how sick in the body she might be, she wasn't that sick in the head. She could never be sick enough to conceive of something like that. Though it wouldn't have been possible if it actually appeared outside her window that distant, rainy night. She saw its body almost entirely. The cave painting image in the wall of the mall was clearly an attempt to depict the same entity, albeit in an abstract, exaggerated manner, like Picasso's pictures of twisted, asymmetrical humans. In general layout, it was at least humanoid. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head atop the torso, and no clothes. Its body was pear-shaped, a protuberant gut jutting out with thick veins crawling up the tightly stretched skin. Its arms hung down to its hips, each holding a dead human, age uncertain, by the neck, their blue bodies void of life. Unlike in the simple picture, they were inescapable in their agony. Hanging limply and soaked with water, she'd seen their slack faces, white eyes and shredded clothes. Most real of all, however, had been the deep bruises from being constricted by the muscular, thick-fingered red hands of this bulbous, deformed thing. It stood knee-high in the water around the house, legs black from rot. The bloated, distended stomach hid any identification of its gender, but its sloping shoulders led up to its face. And its face, like the picture that represented it both perfectly and poorly, had penetrated Trisha's mind forever with its stare. Eyes as big as fists gazed back at her, huge black pupils almost, but not quite, taking up the entire circumference. Its mouth was open in an anatomically sacrilegious grin, and its teeth seemed to pierce diseased gums, as if they were not its own teeth, but those of a horse or bull transplanted into this head by some form of crude, Paleolithic surgery. Tangled, filthy hair hung down to its neck, which was easily as long as she was tall. A hooked nose pointed downwards, and in those blank, all-black eyes, she saw a desire as alien to her when she was a child as it was now. The thing looked down without moving its head, leaving white crescents in the corners of its eyes. It looked at the first kill in its hand, and then the second in its other, and then at her, the third. Ice pelted the windows like gunfire on tanks, and Trisha curled into a ball, as if some kind of supernatural shell shock had just set in. Trisha did not sleep that evening. Mom came home from work and saw her on the couch, sitting there, eyes sunken, glazed and stirring with thoughts as foreign as the thoughts of a stone. Mom kept coming back to the living room, watching her stare at the television screen, her mouth agape and ape-like, as if she had something to say. Whenever her mother came by, Trisha changed the channels repeatedly, trying to give the impression that some measure of cognition was put into her actions. Before her mother went to bed at 8:30, she whispered at Trisha to get some rest, so she could be ready for school as soon as possible. When Trisha didn't respond, she repeated herself. Trisha continued not to respond until her mother finally turned off the lights and went to bed. Trisha continued to stare at the screen, trying to think and trying not to. A late-night cooking show featured a set of chrome pasta bowls. The hostess ran her fingers around the circumference of the lid, and as she did so, extended them until they more resembled albino spider legs. As the camera panned up, she flicked the remote's up button swiftly as possible. Before she saw the hostess's face, the mouth ripped back to reveal rows of cat teeth, and the eyes that stretched until they reached the end of time. A talk show host blasted meaningless gabble. Slick and edged, his hair suddenly flowed into fins or crests of some kind, like a chameleon or an exotic bird. Eyes sank back into his head, leaving sulking sockets hanging like flaring nostrils. His jabbering mouth started to fall apart, first the jaw, then the teeth. Some of them remained in mid-air, suspended beneath the host's face, as he jabbered to a seated movie star. The star in question had been discussing his upcoming Christmas movie, but was waylaid by the sudden absence of a face. All his features became obscured by wrinkled, waxy folds of skin melting together, while his limbs became boneless tendrils. He flailed and screamed and howled suffocating nonsense before both figures jolted and stilled. Then, as the audience continued its recycled laughter, the two figures turned to Trisha, as if expecting her to ease their now inescapable torment and trauma. Finally, she clicked over and over until she got to the unpaid HBO and Cinemax channels. Here, she felt safe for a moment. Because her parents never bought them, there was only screaming static, a place she shouldn't have been able to see anything at all. Funny, she thought. Her parents wouldn't pay for HBO or Cinemax, and so she'd spent many years staring at static, looking for one of those tear-jerking Oscar pictures, or at least glimpses of something high quality enough that she'd believe her parents wouldn't dare expose her to it.
It's all static, honey. You can't see anything. And if you do, it's something you shouldn't see.
So right now, Trisha shouldn't see anything. Yet she did. In the rolling snow she saw dancing things. Like the being from her last dream, they were humanoid in the vague sense that they had 4 limbs and upright torsos, and were cursed with faces in some fashion or another. These faces were blurred by masks of static, while their boneless appendages flailed about in celebration? Of what? Their new home in Trisha's mind? Or was it mockery? She flicked upwards again and again, but the static didn't die. It seemed to get stronger and angrier as she struggled with the remote, her fingers gone numb. Limbs of black velvet swung about like insect legs. The blue-white light formed horizontal flames, while the screeching things behind them hid and leapt out at deceptively whimsical intervals. Trisha felt weightless. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The hands reached out to her, black and velvety. They reached into her, and inside her, cold and piercing like the bitter frost outside. Wailing laughter cut through her skull to her brain as she felt their velvet skin swallowing her, devouring her. Faces of death, white and black-eyed like Japanese oni masks, circled around her and above her like starving predators, deriding her.
This weak little thing of skin and bones. What can she do? What can she do? What can she do? What can she do?
Over and over and over again, and in her frailty, humility, and defeat, she said nothing at all. What was there that she could possibly have to say?
2 more weeks were left until holiday break. Not even that. It was already Thursday when she went back. Then there would be the weekend, which she dreaded for the first time in her life. Sleep was so much easier to avoid at school. If somebody wasn't yelling at you, they were yelling at somebody else. Up until now, it was all meaningless background noise, like static used to be. Now the shrieking that echoed off the cold, steel lockers formed audio patterns, either new or unnoticed until this pivotal instant in Trisha's life. Like static had recently, she thought gravely. Did everyone hear it? Or just her? Either way, it demanded attention, a thing unreal, now too real to ignore.
I need you. I need you.
It crept out of the hallway cacophony like a mist, weaving between the familiar words of her tolerated friends and suddenly less imposing bone and flesh tormentors. The halls were decorated with familiar seasonal bearings. Glittery cutout snowflakes plastered above the lockers, red and green ribbons above the doorways, a plastic menorah and a Christmas tree outside the main entrance in the cold, wind-blasted and lifeless winter landscape. Trisha saw them as she walked by the school's unopenable, half-fogged windows on her way to social studies. As the props shook in the wind, Trisha thought she saw things hiding behind them, peeking around, looking at her, whispering,
I need you.
Trisha screamed like a fox beneath an eight-wheeler when Bryce tapped her on the shoulder. Because this was between classes, her scream was muffled with the rest of the deafening sounds that filled every corner of Old Haven's barely functional schoolhouse. "Jumpin' Jesus," he said. "What the hell's gotten into you, Ghost? Shell shock or crystal meth?" Bryce stood a head taller than Trisha, his dirty blonde hair hanging down in uncombed curls. He looked at her with a sudden understanding in his black eyes, his playful adolescent sadism melting into what mild empathy he had to offer.
Sorry,
Her retainer slurred her words, and her feeble hands shook like a sick rabbit's. Her eyes darted this way and that, as if giving Bryce any attention at all might leave her vulnerable to some kind of ambush. Bryce stuck his hands in his pockets and watched her, analytical. He looked more as if he was watching to see what she'd do next, like a scientist observing an animal, rather than somebody on her mental and physical level. He was, of course, but more often than not, he acted as if he wasn't.
Bad dreams,
Trisha said, straightening her posture and sticking her hands in her own pockets, as if to challenge him. "You having him right this goddamn minute?" he asked.
I don't know, maybe,
she said. He gave her some kind of look, and she gave him some kind of other look, and things did not progress as they should have.
I was up all night, most of yesterday, too. It was intense,
she said. "Deets?" he asked. Details. The second bell rang, 4 short dings. Trisha jolted at each one of them equally, as if each ding stabbed her.
"I'll tell you later," she said.
She rushed away, huddled beneath a cloak that she only imagined was there. She bumped into a few kids on the way to wherever she was going, and found herself in the girls' bathroom, falling against the wall and waiting for the crowds outside to disperse. Clinging to the edge of a sink, she reflected on what had just happened. Normally, she wasn't stupid enough to let other kids slam her into lockers or walls. Now she had a scraped shoulder and a bruise on her thigh from being thrown around like a rag doll by the bigger jocks. The captain of the track team, tyrannical bitch that she was, had been the one to elbow her into the lockers, shouting, "Fucking freak!" at her, as she was never hesitant to do. The sensation was more pleasing than any touch she'd ever received before. Fake nails, as jagged as any talons, grazed her shoulder even through her thick, gray sweater. Surrounded by a chronicle of bathroom graffiti that stretched back into the 60s, she needed to focus on anything else, anything that might not evoke the hellish caricatures that had been taking shape everywhere around her. Removing her sweater to caress her scraped shoulder, running her other hand over her bruised thigh, she savored the pain. It reminded her of what was real, what actually existed in actual fact, rather than what her eyes and ears were telling her was thriving like a deadly mold all around her. But it didn't matter anymore. She'd seen the face, the same track captain's face that had spit grievous insult after grievous insult at her, day after day after day, looked back at her with sadistic arrogance as she was left behind every single time she ran. The beautiful features, fit for a model, that she'd been so jealous of for years before. For the brief space where they'd met eyes, those features evaporated. Now she had seen only dead, lidless fish eyes set in a hatefully ape-like face. The glisten of fluorescent lights on her skin seemed to make her skin glow like plasticine, and her hair seemed to puncture her scalp like pieces of wire in bleeding clay. And it did bleed, too. She saw with perfect precision that her reddish hair was that color because of blood in the roots glistening above the eyes of a suddenly living mounted animal. A fish-lipped grin stretched across her mannequin face, full of all too human teeth. Trisha ran her fingers along the colorfully vandalized brick wall, whatever the graffiti had been drawn with, caking beneath her nails. Focusing hard enough, she did not think, only felt. Concentrating harder, she only felt brick and a piercing cold on her skin, with only flashes of the nightmares around her jumping into her head here and there. For now, that was enough. But very soon, it wouldn't be. It was that goddamn drawing. The one on the side of the mall, the one she'd walked past on a day that now felt like it took place before the birth of the stars. Funniest thing, she thought bitterly, it wasn't there when she walked by again, that first day back at school since her inexplicable illness abated. Well, abated in the eyes of her mother and teachers. She didn't see it on the way to school, though at the time she barely escaped panic by assuming that she must have walked by a different part of the building, something she had never done before. Or maybe somebody washed it off, the tightened thing scrubbed out and down in less than a few hours, and the smeared, necrotic blue of its distended abdomen burned out and repaved with fresh granite. How efficient, in a town where the same shell and Sunoco had been running, rusted and barely functional, for the past 60 years, and where the hip, new thing was a sushi restaurant that opened before she was born. She stopped to stare at them all. Already the sun was low, the sky a roof of thin, rippled clouds. Deep purple spilled through the open tears in the cirrus, a golden red glow on the horizon seeming to bleed out of the swaying trees. Snowflakes glowed in the lights of the mall parking lot, shimmering as they flowed by like salt in deep ocean currents. Vast mountains of snow, small hills of solid light, rose and fell around the black gravel like waves of ivory. The parking lot was almost emptied by now. There was little to do this time of year, and the frantic last-minute shopping would take place in a week or so. Fewer people meant fewer non-people emerging out of the nondescript strangers Trisha had been surrounded by for the past 15 years. There had been a time when Ghost would have been compelled to get home faster by the biting winds and lungfuls of needles that winter so often brings. Her legs would start to shake, aching to run after a long day of unbearable stillness. Now, she was savoring the numbness, steam rising from her open mouth, and the wet snow soaking through her clothes. Her hair rippled like a steam, and seeing it, Trisha suddenly thought that she was, indeed, at the bottom of a sea, this ocean floor somehow a lit and livable mirror of the human world above it. Was this a dream? Was the mall still there, in the realer world, that nameless image still painted or carved into the walls? Or was that mall the dream one, and this the real one? It had been there. There was no denying that. It had been there, as real as she ever was, and now it wasn't there anymore. It had taken Siren's flight into her heart and mind, and now would live there forever, nesting and infesting her with its grotesque, malformed offspring. A tempting thought came to her, maybe her own, maybe something planted in her like the graven image had been before. What if she simply stayed here and let the cold devour her, so that she would not sleep again? She would never see them that way, either the things in her dreams or the people around her who'd clearly formed some kind of unholy allegiance with them. She'd be safe in the womb of oblivion from metaphysical predators whose hunger was worse than death. She stood there, letting the night take hold and the snow continue to swarm and multiply like millions of crystal insects. Soon they would suffocate her, choke her to death and set her free. There were no figures here, she felt. None at all. One thing took hold, though, a notion that danced about, taunting her like the velvet-skinned, still things that lived in the static of the television set.
What if death is sleep eternal?
It wasn't her voice, whispering it into her ears on the numbing, gnawing wind. It was one of theirs, indistinct but soft, hissing like an ethereal snake winding about in her clouded thinking. Trisha had once heard somebody refer to death as an eternal, dreamless sleep. That was what she'd been hoping for in the hours made aeons since the nightmares began to feed. But if death wasn't dreamless, then it wasn't safe from them. It wasn't an escape, but as hopelessly inescapable as being buried alive. She wanted to hide, to wait until somebody saved her, or she found some way out of the slaughtering pen. Until the night simply passed over and gave way to dawn. Trisha looked around. There were no cars. None. The last of them had left the parking lot sometime after she'd made a commitment to suicide, and now left her alone. Alone in the roaring snow, like growing static. Static. Snow surrounded her on gusts of aggressive wind, and in the whiteout figures began to stir once more, taunting her, harassing her, biting her without jaws, and flicking their tongues against her thoughts. Trisha turned around and got on with walking home.
Midnight arrived and left unannounced, a brief bystander in Trisha's world. Mom tried to talk to her. Trisha told her, as her mother was mid-sentence, that she was too tired to talk about anything, and she wanted to be left alone. Because her mother's brain had been half dissolved by the soul-grinding work of just being alive for decades on end, she continued speaking, even after Trisha went to her room and sat down on the dull, white carpet, twirling the fabric in her fingers and running her palms on the surface until they burned. If her palms burned, she couldn't sleep, and if she couldn't sleep, as painful as the feeling was, it meant she was safe. For the time being. Sleep crept on her in successive strikes, like a cobra preserving venom and testing its bites on a cornered pack animal. It would come to her as she slumped against the sterile alabaster wall, the ceiling fan's dull breeze and even duller light, slowly phasing in and out like a candle in the growing wind. Without exception, something would pierce the oldest part of her psyche, and she'd burst back to consciousness. The wind pressing against the glass panes, as if something was trying to get in. The creaking of floorboards, as if something was pressing upwards, out from beneath her. The flickering lights, as the power threatened to go out for days on end. This had happened at least once a year, usually more, since Trisha had been born. When the wind struck the windows, she remembered what she saw that first night. The behemoth outside the window, how it gazed at her, human form reshaped to the point where it was still all too recognizable, gazing at her with eyes that said something nobody who ever lived could put into words. No, that was a lie. She knew exactly what those eyes said. I need you. I need you. How bad did it need her now? And what would it do to get her? The lights flickered again. They went out for a full minute, perhaps, all while the roaring storm pressed against the panes, and something too organic to be wind or a car horn yawned in excruciating hunger. Cold air seeped in through the windows at that moment. It smelled of dead vegetation and dried bone marrow, the breath of a monstrous pagan deity, resurrected from the earth's frigid womb to feed once more. The lights went out. Her mother and father, brain dead as they'd been since their minds finally blew all their fuses during the summer of '69, stirred in the other room, but did not wake. Trisha had a dim sense of the world around her, of 6 flat surfaces that should have been there. 4 walls, a ceiling, a carpeted floor, a Panasonic TV older than she was against one wall, and on the other a bookshelf she hadn't touched in years, and the north and west walls fitted with windows for the summertime. And then she felt that one of the windows wasn't there. It had been replaced by nothing, and briefly Trisha felt a cold blast of wind before something reached in, seizing her neck and wrenching her towards its open mouth. She felt her bones stretch and distort, like clay in a sculptor's hands, as it pulled her towards its open maw, her body stretching like she was in a melting painting. In the perfect darkness, she somehow saw what was happening in the third person. Her pale body was stretched and pulled through the frozen night, thick-fingered, wrinkled, and elephantine hands wrenching her neck first from the corner she'd hid in. Her eyes bulged and popped like her assailants', and her mouth opened like a snake's, to let out a scream that echoed to the stars and back. She saw her limbs extend and wave around like whips, fighting against the oppressive wind and shearing snow in the blackness. The long-necked, wild-haired thing that had desecrated her childhood memories now had her by the throat. Through the sickening impossibility of its mere presence, she'd become warped as well, her rope arms and legs thrashing against its bloated, discolored flesh.
As she did so, she felt her skin against her attackers. It slashed its flesh open, bloodless wounds spilling fumes of decay to the winter's gale. Steam followed, its body heat reacting to the vicious chills and sending a blood-curdling scream out of its anglerfish jaws. Trisha, if she could still be called such an unbecoming name in this hellish new body, shrieked in tune with her assailant. She screeched into the wind and enveloped its neck in her new arms. She felt its blubbery skin yield as it struggled to bring her closer to its killing jaws. Anguish beyond human grasp filled its offset eyes, wrinkled brow declaring its turmoil even as its ever-grinning mouth struggled towards her in slow motion, engulfing her face, her head. In her new body, with its flailing rope arms and legs, Trisha willed herself to bite down, her perspective returning to her new, nocturnal eyes as she felt her teeth begin to shatter and crack. New teeth grew and drove out the old, some coming in through the roof of her mouth, crimson jagged fangs that shredded her own tongue as she bit down on a soft, pulpy surface that tasted necrotic. The predator's throat. She was biting down against its throat from the inside. Unwilling prey, she tore into the titan's throat with her new jaws and wrenched her neck backwards. Thrashing her head in the slow motion of a dream, she pulled backwards as the Goliath's upper teeth grazed her scalp. Mortally wounded, it drowned the wind out with its dreamlike wail, breath harrowing its opponent one last time as she pulled back with a piece of its neck in her mouth. Its lower jaw hung from her teeth, still fused to the piece of windpipe she had torn from its living body. Trisha felt awesome strength in her new weapons, taking ownership of them as if these sinuous arms and jagged fangs had been there her whole life. Tearing up the flesh in her mouth, she worked her way down to its severed mandible. Cracking the ropes of tendon, teeth, and bone, she saw its agony and, yes, its horror, as its lazy eyes rolled down to its now mutilated, grinding mouth. Trisha fell from its grasp not because it released her, but because her dream skin tore in its hands. Blood flowed into the winter gale like a wound in the water, and she did not question it. New senses overwhelmed her, and Trisha welcomed them. It was as if she'd been trapped in solid rock for years, and could only now break free. On her new arms and legs she balanced against the snow, resting on the surface like a waterfly. It felt as if her arms had always been so short, so painfully constrained, and now were set free to stretch for the first time. Her skin, silver in the moonlight, flexed beneath shredded clothes. No cold breeze touched her, no snow burned a chill against her. Her hair extended and soared in the wind, but it no longer gave her discomfort. With eyes like an Arctic jaguar's, she observed her slaughtered foe, dead in the snow beneath her. There were no humans, here and now. This was a mirror world, a dream world where, for the time being, only two entities remained, and only one, her, remained standing. Sinking into her new senses, she skimmed the snow gracefully to the body of her dead marauder. Pathetic, its bloated, pachydermal corpse had not yet ceased to steam. Without hesitation, she sank her hands into it, bent down, and applied all the pressure her stunning new teeth possessed into tearing meat from its body. Her throat expanded and so did her torso as she fed and fed, filling herself with its precious sustenance. Ruthless, royal pride known only to the beasts and a deep, bottomless indulgence consumed her, as the most core parts of her new psyche were finally satiated. New thoughts filled her corrected form with an intoxicating euphoria. Within this dream, she dreamt of the beautifully grotesque new shapes she could take, and the new prey she could take down. Drunk, She fed to fullness and further before the darkness began to grow. Engrossed in feeding, she did not use her new faculties to feel the gloom growing all around her. It was obscuring even her novel predatory instincts, as she was absorbed by another world. The waking world. The prison world where she'd been born. For a brief time, she fell into true, deathly slumber. When she woke, she lay on the floor of her room. Nothing seemed out of place, save herself. But everything did, indeed, feel all the more suffocating. Outside of chance encounters with mosquitoes and bees, Trisha never experienced extended periods of disgust. There were moments of brief unease, as when some of the boys talked about imaginary sexual exploits, or the popular girls trilled about her nauseating physical appearance while she sat a few rows up in class. Her skin turned hot as iron in those moments, and it was as if something was crawling up and down her bones. But mostly, her world had been comfortably gray, like the sky was the morning she awoke from her kill. Gray, blank, lifeless. Things had evidently changed. All the following day, Trisha felt confined, not only in this hard and unyielding reality, but in this tight, choking skin. She'd gone to school in a beige tank top and flesh-colored jeans, a pale green hoodie tied about her waist. The old building's cheap heating spat from vents thick with all sorts of dusts, molds, and God knows what else, made the halls reek and burn like a coal mine. Loose as Ghost's clothes were, they did nothing to abate the constricting ache. Cutting out of fourth period science class, she sat in the library. Before, she would have worried about being caught. Since then, having been caught and survived, she worried about something more immediate. Liam Hicks had died the previous night. Bryce Harlow had informed her as she walked into school. Aneurysm, he'd said, looking as grave as a teenager can look. His mom just woke up and he was gone. Wouldn't get up.
Jesus Christ,
Trisha said.
that could be one of us.
That's what I thought too, Ghost. It's deep to think about. And pretty scary, seriously. Trisha had the strangest idea that Bryce wasn't taking this whole matter as seriously as she was. Some teacher wouldn't even come in, she's crying so much, Bryce added. Over the intercom, the principal made an announcement saying anyone burdened by this tragic loss could find solace in the counselor's office, a place useless for anything before or after this incident, as far as Bryce and Ghost were concerned. If the things behind reality's curtains were at all sentimental, they must have taken the day off as well. All day the colors had seemed grayer, and the real world a little bit less tangible. Beyond that, nobody had revealed anything other than a familiar human ugliness to her in the hours since she'd woken up in her room, the taste of alien flesh still tingling on the edges of her lips and tongue. Liam Hicks had interacted with her exactly once. He was a tall, gangly boy with curly blonde hair and chameleon pop eyes. His teeth were crooked, which explained her mutilated retainer. On his sleek and insectile form, his hands looked big as bat wings. He was one of those boys cursed with a pear-shaped body, which could be made passably attractive on the luckier girls of the world, but which was universally nauseating on men. Like all insecure adolescents, including Trisha, he hid his malformed body under loose-fit clothes. Because he was, unlike her, perfectly comfortable with his designation as one of the school's untouchables, the one time Liam and Ghost interacted was when he'd stolen her retainer and put it in his mouth. Even if it hadn't been gnawed and utterly destroyed, she would never have touched it again anyways. Infuriated, her parents got her a new one, and she cried for weeks over the incident. To this day, she was still uncomfortable with it, seeing as everyone brought it up whenever she was within earshot. For somebody who was content to be seen as vulgarity incarnate, the school's collective heart and soul bled for the poor youth. He was to get a full 2-page spread in the yearbook, and to have a memorial put in place by the flag outside school. There it would share a space alongside the other 5 children who'd died since the schoolhouse was built decades ago. The collective adults, and all 6 or 7 of Liam's friends, mourned publicly. Grievous displays ranged from lifeless declarations of regret to the art teacher who broke down sobbing in the middle of class, reflecting on the hideous artwork Liam created. Tears running down her cheeks, she lamented the loss of an individual mind and a talented, passionate artist. Liam's friends, a conclave of unhygienic, physically warped rejects and outcasts, formed a circle around the site outside the school where they normally met in the morning before classes. Beneath the dead, bare tree and under the dead, bare sky, all of them stood silent in respect or fond memories. Trisha had trouble fathoming what respect or fond memories they could possibly have for him. To her, it finally felt as if the holidays were here. The school's ever-vandalized tree and menorah looked beautiful, not the least because their lights were mere lights, not the eyes of some nightmarish thing watching her constantly. They shone dimly, buzzing before the school's cheap glass doors. During study hall and lunch, she went to the front steps and sat outside, her pale green hoodie just barely shielding her from the shearing cold. She made sure to sit a few steps down so any hall monitors passing through the front of the school wouldn't see her. As hard as her nickname was to get used to, she was glad for her ghostly complexion. She had the idea it camouflaged her against the school's white, dull walls. Funny, she enjoyed the ambience of the season. Before, the lights were usually pretty, and the dead trees rasped and brushed each other in the soothing way she liked. Yet now, all she could think about was being concealed, beneath the steps, out of the range of the feeble hall monitors. Nothing was peering at her from either the glass doors or the trees, but all her focus was on the dark spaces between the trees, the road besides the school, the light sheet of snow on the dead grass. Had they fallen back? Had killing one of their shapeless hordes sent the omnipresent teeth, claws, and tongues back into the void? Had Liam Hicks intended to be the warped abomination in her dream, or was it all some kind of freak psychic manslaughter? The wind blew, toilet paper on the plastic Christmas tree flailing in the wind like strips of freshly rendered flesh. That was her first thought anyway. She could smell it, the open wounds of fauna like nothing known to nature in this world. When the bell went off, not morphing into haunting territorial calls for the first time since the dreams began, Ghost went inside and thought about how barren the foliage was around the school. How scarce any prey, metaphysical or otherwise, had been, and how many places there were to lie in wait, how many new morphologies she might take to secure herself there until some poor kid, like Liam Hicks, came along. If only she could recreate this place in the dream world, or find somewhere similar to it, like the mausoleum of Grandma and Grandpa's vacation home. She understood the ache now. It was the oldest instinct humans still had, one branded into the essence of every living thing since life began, in the world of waking and dreams alike. The ache was to hunt, to kill, to feed. As a feeling, it outweighed all others. It was pure and perfect, soft and clean, like slipping into a warm bath after coming home on a frigid winter's night. In a perverse way, it was fitting. The cold paralyzed her choking prison skin, and the rope-limbed body she'd taken in the dream burned inside her like the core of the sun. Fighting, thrashing, screaming to get out, to skulk and stalk and weave betwixt the dead trees, eyes like a falcon seeking something soft, fresh, nubile. Nights fell, sweeping over her as holiday break came nearer and nearer still. Slowly, the days stretched endlessly on, as her limbs once did in the other world. Dreams would not come to her, and sleep didn't either. Sitting in the dark, after the Grinch had stolen and returned Christmas, and Olive became a reindeer, she watched the static and the late night inanity. She watched and waited, patient as a mountain lion. But the pain grew harsher, sharper, like she'd swallowed thorn vines in a past life, ones that were still growing, even in a new shell. Ghost had feeding to do. It was the Sunday before the last week of school, when the dreams began to happen again. Trisha's guard had fallen, and her recollections were her own once more. It was something of a pleasant surprise, and a bit more of a grave disappointment. On one hand, her pre-lived life was left untouched. Good parts of her childhood were preserved like precious gems, and in her slowly returning dreams, she could venture through them as voluntarily as her subconscious would allow. On the other, they had become about as sterile as gems usually are. Mom held her up in her arms, towering over her like an agile giant and swinging her around. Her mother's singing echoed, and her giggles did so in tune. The sun was brighter than ever, and spring's morning air kissed her like fresh water on a hot day. She felt nothing. Her father, a great big man with great big hands, wrestled with a salmon that was bigger than she was as a child. In her dream, as in her 6-year-old life, her father promised her the fish was dead. When she stroked its sleek scales, it suddenly exploded back to life and thrashed her into the soil. Laughing, her father pulled her back up, and she tried to wipe the soil off her back and legs. While she hadn't cried at the time, she did have an aversion to seafood ever since. These were sanctuaries of the past once, places she could hide from day-to-day life. Before the game. Now, each one felt like a fabrication. No, worse. A lie. It was as if the past, relived or otherwise, was the nightmare. Other scenes, the ones in which her body was set free from the chains of gravity, physiology, and anatomy, were where she felt the most at home. That ache, dull and numb in the waking world, was all the worse now. In the bitter and temporarily dying world of winter, it was manageable. In the dreams, where all her senses were sharp as a hunter's blade, the thirst for deformity was palpable. It gnawed at her until eventually it began to peek through. Not as powerfully as it had been at first, but promisingly enough that she hadn't let go of that hope that the monsters would return. In more recent dreams, Mom didn't bend over to bring Trisha into her arms, for example. A feature of her remembrances as sacred as Bible pages was now engulfed in delightful heresy, her mother's arms growing longer to pick her up while her teeth fell out. Instead of an overjoyed maternal glow, Mom now brought her to a lamprey's wet, open mouth. Her eyes grew vaster, sank into her head like new mouths to match the biggest one. Ears grew pointed and twitched, and her hair fell out as if shed by radiation poisoning. Dad's laughter became eerie ambient calls like a dying whale. His chest blew out and sucked in like a pufferfish, while his clothes bled. She saw then, through Child's eyes changed beyond recognition, that his clothes were part of his flesh. Shedding like the skin of a reptile, they flapped and tattered over his shining gray-green skin. His bald head became featureless, save his roaring maw, and the salmon's tail forked into flailing tendrils like those on a dancing squid. Human-like screaming, malformed as if heard through an old FM radio signal, emerged from its now human face. It was a face that she recognized as an old friend who she hadn't seen since preschool. Suffering incarnate, the child's face spattered blood from where the hook had its tongue. It screamed for Ghost to help her, save her. Please, she didn't want to die. Trisha woke silently, the ache abated, but not by enough. The next night came with agonizing lethargy, the day's mundane trials each worse than the last. Bryce tried to talk to her in the library. She heard nothing. Sitting there, he droned on and on and on. Ghost nodded, in agreement, and spoke less than a tree. Liam's death had already blown over, and his circle of friends maintained the same distance from the rest of the world that Trisha now did. All speech became noise, all faces went blank. A world of mannequins. Only one phrase seemed to come to her from one of Liam's friends as she passed by in the hallways, cloaked in a dark, red hoodie that was so big it seemed almost like papal robes. She walked to Trisha, both swiftly and slowly, as if she were walking underwater, or against the bitter winds that the school's dark, brick walls protected them from for now. That hoodie would have contrasted deeply with Ghost's green one, if only color still mattered to her. But it did not, and all she saw was her angular, pale face as it whispered sullenly. A voice as frigid as the world had become spoke briefly. At the time, it barely struck her, but on the cold, dark walk home, as the bruised twilight overwhelmed the bleeding sunset, it was all that Trisha could hear. This world is damned. It belongs to the dead. As the final bell rang for school, 4 short dings, Trisha remembered what the girl had said. She walked out and stopped, looking around. The wind brushed over her, but it burned very little. Every Christmas before she'd loved the fresh, new chill of winter. But as the sun died in the horizon, and the poorly lit tree and menorah went out, she felt as if she were at the bottom of the sea. For the first time in her life, she was finally, truly alone. Save for the words she heard. Trisha hadn't run since the nightmares began, but she sprinted home, legs pumping furiously in the night. The mall was as lit up as ever, the pre-holiday sales screaming for sycophants. Cars breezed in and out of the parking lot, shrieking tires and blaring horns sounding off in the twilight. Beneath the neon signs and above the sleek, slight sheet of snow, there was something painted or carved into the mall wall. As before, the wind fled from it. The smell of fresh snow fused with the smell of dead branches, and something else that had no parallel. The newcomer drawn into the wall was tall, svelte, cloaked in a shroud of human flesh that hung off 6 sleek, blackened humanoid arms. Its stark, white head was totally hairless. Pointed ears, like goat's horns, faced outwards from its oblong skull, and teeth like pointed cage bars hung open in an endless, wordless cry. From out of its non-existent abdomen, transparent fetal beings emerged on umbilical cords. Each one possessed jutting limbs ending in feeling hairs, like unraveled twine. Veins, organs, and glowing nervous systems were all visible in their outlines, their faces holding fully human eyes, and teeth beneath whatever glassy hides shielded them. Trisha soaked it all in, examining each aspect of its anatomy, each element of its physiology, produced by no known form of natural biological evolution. People streamed in and out of the mall, like ants in and out of a mound. They didn't see it, either consciously or otherwise. This was something for her, and her alone, and so she was the only one challenged by it, enlightened by it. And so she savored it, as she once savored this season and its rituals, until full night had come, and the last car had driven away from the sterile, lifeless parking lot. Deer walked across the black pavement, their hooves echoing against the huge gray wall, to be swallowed by the demon painting therein. She walked home, tasting her new kill from somewhere as far as the stars, and as near as the next few hours. "Trisha," her father said when she walked in. "Sit down, please." Dinner was ready when she got home, a rarity considering her mother had days off as frequently as animals bled necrotic smoke. Which is to say, it was a new and novel event that was happening for the first time ever, and would likely become unremarkable within a week. At the head of the table, her father ran his hand through his thinning hair and met Trisha's gaze in fleeting, nervous intervals. "I'm not hungry," she said. "Trisha, you're not eating as much as you used to. You'll get sick again. Now sit down." Her mother didn't pay attention. She was boiling potatoes. Stirring mechanically, she went about the same task she'd done time and time again, with thoughts as barren as the soil of Mercury. "I ate already. There's a vending machine at school." "That's not proper nutrition, sweetie," her father said. The kitchen light reflected off his head, and Trisha felt sick, imagining the follicles growing through his skin like the track captain briefly possessed. Drenched in oils, there was a reeking stench that she'd never noticed before. Stepping towards the chair at the end of the table, she realized she was being overpowered by the nauseating malodor of human. The floral tablecloth ruffled when her mother placed the mashed potatoes and green beans in front of her. It smelled worse than rotting seaweed. "What's the matter?" asked her mother, feeble face halfway between concern and insult. "I don't know," she said. "Just tired." "Is it school?" her father asked, already eating. He made animalistic sounds, masticating steak to pieces, and Trisha felt a brief pang of nostalgia for an era she'd never lived through in this reality. "Yeah," she nodded, as if her head was being bobbed on a steel cord. "Finals before vacation. You know, life." "You'll feel better when Christmas comes around," said her mother, reaching out and touching her shoulder. Trisha recoiled as if she'd been stabbed. Her parents glared at her like she'd just pissed on a crucifix. "I just need to sleep it off," she said. "Restore energy, make up for the studying, you know?" It wasn't a lie, so she forced a terrifying smile to accentuate the little comfort she could offer these repulsive alien creatures. Pleasantries were exchanged, the daughter was excused, and in the relative safety of her room, Trisha slept the sleep of the dead, in moribund tune with the world of dead trees, grass, and ice outside. The stillness was refreshing. How comforting dying can be when living becomes an act of apostasy. On a gale as desolate as winter itself, the demon hunted silently. Far away, its human shell lay asleep in bed. The gusts of the latest storm had inspired the one it now rode on, in a more fluid reality, separated from this one by the thin and fragile window of consciousness. Its shroud of flesh flaked and shed in the wind, as ever-growing as its mind could generate it. Hollow eyes surveyed an ever-changing landscape, places from its prey's memory that had yet to become a killing field. For a moment, the hunter was surrounded by an endless hallway. Impossibly tall metal lockers rose into forever, sepulchral and ominous. They bled just as swiftly out of existence as did the open blacktop, surrounded by snow and lit by bright lights. This setting was a parking lot, one environed by piles of snow. This bordering edge moved away as the hunter moved forwards, forever placing it at the axis of an empty, open plane of pavement. Disorienting though it should have been, the dream world didn't work according to the rules of should. It was instead comforting. The hunter felt itself the center of the universe for a brief while, until a shrieking snowfall blotted out this ephemeral province, as had the blacktop formed from the ever-growing schoolhouse halls. The torso of the hunter was orb-like, translucent. Shifting and throbbing, it might have appeared an orb of glass to a human observer, holding various sets of innards. This was, in fact, 3 separate bodies. All of them clung together like infant bats as the hunter's main body flew on the wind, waiting for the wind to settle on a setting for the feast to come. Beneath the shroud of their surrogate mother, they made sounds like mice in a kindling stove, their hunger an extension of its own. The wind died down and ceased to carry with it the ever-changing landscapes of ghosts' once treasured childhood memories. Hardwood floors, like open desert, creaked into shape around the hunter, vast as Antarctic wastes. On a ceiling as tall as the sky, windows strained under machine gun rainfall. Or was it snowfall? No matter. It was no more permanently real than anything else in this world, or any other. Prey was here somewhere. Everywhere the hunter turned its ovoid head, it felt Trisha's presence with the dream world equivalent of the serpent's flicking tongue, or the owl's all-seeing eyes. Its ears pointed outwards, heard Trisha's crying in the hallway, emanating from some room in this phantasmagorical mansion. Symbolic they did not truly hear, but they sensed the closest equivalent that the dream world had. Even indoors the wind continued, the creaking boards screaming with the weight that the levitating predator should have carried. This hunter did not need to move. It had other means. Its torso undid itself, 3 creatures drifting down to the floor beneath the shroud of human skin. Their innards were connected to the central body by umbilical cords, save for the fact that they did not draw life from their host, but instead fed it to their starving mother through fully human mouths. Transparent lips drew back over clean and even teeth, eyes like men's unblinking, and as wide as deep-sea fishes. Searching, each one went off in its own direction. Gracefully they sought, probing rooms in the tormented and mutilated house for the source of the weeping. The wood felt cold and dusty beneath soft fingers, bones visible through the outlines. They felt out for Trisha's skin, which they could make pliable and easily punctured by willing it. The halls stretched further and further as each one sought out a different room, a different territory. Their umbilical cords stretched further and further, as it was in their own host's will to do so. Through the eyes of the children, the mind of the hunter saw everything, 3 separate visions, converging on its own. The end of a hallway came into sight. Nocturnal vision surveyed a tall, wooden door. A golden handle glowed unnaturally in the perfect darkness. The handle turned, the door opened, and the weeping stilled. Whether other parts of the house still existed was meaningless. The other 2 children may have been sent off to other rooms that Trisha didn't remember, and as such had been lost to existence for now. But this one seemed to have found her hiding place, and it loped into the dark room slowly and patiently. Time already tenuous, was even more fleeting here. Places and things could cease to be very briefly, and so patience in its inhabitants was even briefer. Feeling out on its worm-like fingers, the seeker looked for Trisha, whose weeping still echoed after it had ended. This was a child's room, the main hunter concluded, as its mobile eyes and hands continued to feel around this place. There was a small bed in the corner, sheets with misshapen Sesame Street characters on a small wooden frame. Plastic dolls and puppets lined the corners, lit by illumination cast upwards from nowhere. The eyes followed the invader as it felt around the room. Something it saw only in its peripheral vision. There was a sound like a door slamming shut on a human neck, a soft, wet crack. The child shrieked in pain, wrenching its severed cord from the door. The door had slammed of its own accord, commanded shut by some unseen force. One that suddenly grew thicker and stronger in this room like a humid fog. Now that the child was separated, it was vulnerable. All the dolls turned to stare at their new kill, their plastic and metal hands harder than any of its whip-like fingers. Severed from its host, the main body couldn't see what was happening. The hunter heard only shrieks and rending flesh, and the infinite catacombs of this house suddenly shrank smaller around it. A brief spasm of realization took place, stretching out infinitely in the hunter's dream mind. In that unending moment, 2 more doors slammed shut, severing all its cords eternally in this timeless, formless nightmare prison. As its ropes of flesh flailed and bled, it looked around frantically at its shrinking surroundings. The notion of growing smaller and breaking through one of the windows into the rainy void appeared in its mind, only for the windows to grow teeth and begin slamming down in a deafening burst. Shards of broken, gray enamel flew at the flesh-shrouded predator, tearing its skin like a hail of gunfire. Hollow eyes should not see. But even if this occurred to the skin-cloaked abomination, it would be useless. Trisha wanted it to see. So it did. Light grew from nowhere, as it had in the child's room before the door slammed shut and severed the drone's lifeline to its overmind. The window jaws slammed shut and sank like teeth in the mud, lost to the dull, white painted walls that slowly began to consume all doors, furniture, and escape routes. 6 pale walls somehow grew and receded all at the same time, the furniture sinking into subdued grayish pools. Where its intestinal tendrils met any surface, they sank as well. And into this featureless, ivory mass they were pulled. One of the walls began to bleed. Thick red blood flowed from the white as if spilling upwards from the surface of a frozen pond. In the open wound, tearing and pulling from the now pulpy and decaying mass of liquid whiteness, the hunter's gaze became trapped, just as its tendrils were. It could feel them wrenching from its body, pulling as tangibly as if it were happening to its unconscious human host. Trisha emerged from the open wound, her skin the color of chalk, and hair as red as the blood that purified it. With teeth of solid night, she smiled wider than ever before. New and reflective eyes set down on the causality of this visceral secret game, who was so arrogant as to walk right into her open jaws thinking it could overpower her. Her gaze was the color one sees when their own eyes are closed. The reddish violet of deep concentration, or meditation, or sleep. The last thing the hunters saw was Trisha's open mouth, swollen lips pulling back like an eel's, while her violet eyes reflected the unnatural glow that she herself had willed to be there. A glow that would allow her assailant to see its end in all its hideous glory. There were abstractions as the boundless dream world melted back into the unyielding prison world, as Trisha had long since come to think of it. Trisha, in the shared mind that the shifting house and she herself both owned, felt her teeth gnaw at soft, pulpy meat. Thoughts ripped out of a dying mind with the same burning savor and instinctual efficiency that bears unleash upon flailing salmon and wolves upon flailing men. At the west end of Old Haven, Trisha woke from the other world, feeling weightless and peaceful. Void of thought, her mind was as clear as spring water. There was nothing here in her room, the dark blue of the snowstorm casting light through her shutters across the ceiling. None of the faces formed in the darkness, none of the obscured bookshelves or furniture bled into demonic atrocities. She had played the game effectively, and now this prison world felt more like a cave, a safe, cool place where she could rest between kills. The howling wind did not reshape the world around it, but she was appreciative of its presence. It inspired the world-morphing winds of her trap, of course. She could rely on its ambience to visualize the shifting landscape she'd intended to create, to trap the bombastic predator that had poured so much thought and imagination into such an impractically fantastic form. At the north end of Old Haven, Macy Evans lay still, limbs as strained and tortured as an Olympian's still radiated unbearable pain in what would have been her waking hours. Physicians would find great stress in her heart, her ligaments, her tendons. Bruises and cuts marked the places her limbs would have been severed in the dream, now a secret ordeal that only participants of the secret game could know. Physicians would mark them up to a particularly traumatic night terror. Such a thing was not unheard of. In 1975, an entire community of Indonesian refugees were wiped out by cardiac arrest, brought on by sleep deprivation from successive nightmares. Rare though it was common enough that it could be accepted as the catalyst for Macy Evans' tragic expiration. Ghost did not see the hooded girl at school all the rest of the final week, but she remembered her words, and they brought her the only solace anyone's words ever had. As soothing as the meaningless, lifeless Christmas carols that filled the radios and the televisions were meant to be, she let it burn inside her and drive her through each sluggish day. This world is damned. It belongs to the dead. And so it did. How useless was the sun when the frost glowed bright enough to cast light back to the heavens and counterattack. How useless are the stars when totally surrounded by frigid, barren darkness for eternity. How futile was this world, this temporary prison of reality, when confronted by the infinite freedom of the one we see only in dreams. Liam's friends, who were also Macy's, met Trisha's eyes as she got to school on that final day. She arrived before the sun was up, when the air was still and silent as the smell of fresh snow burning her nostrils. Each contestant steamed the air with their breath, rising from each member of the circle. Wordlessly, they parted wide enough that she could enter. Bryce Harlow stood at the head, if a circle can be said to have one. The others called us all to the game, at one time or another. They've lived in dreams since the beginning, since before anything else. There is no life outside of dreams. Save Ghost, the circle chanted. There is no life outside of dreams. Blessed are we, those few who are offered a glimpse of eternal life. We lie in wait for now, in this place of torment. We lie in wait and hunt when we can, in that beautiful place beyond this God-forsaken exile. The other world is our true home, where we may be forever saved. Many are called, few are chosen. We are the pure, the sanctified, the enlightened. We may be saved from this life for another, where we are free of these ever-rotting, decaying bodies and liberated. Our flesh ours to mend, our limitless minds the landscape in which we rebirth ourselves. We are the pure, the sanctified, the enlightened. And then, with a clarity so often preserved for the religious, Ghost saw it all. In the dream world, where there were no chains or cages or boundaries, other creatures lie in wait. Maybe they'd always been there, awaiting the day when minds would set them free, give them hunting grounds in which to work their magic. Or maybe they evolved in tandem with humans or other thinking animals somewhere, sometime else, in this restrictive reality. Now they needed to reproduce, and like viruses, they did not use the dream world as a site to ambush prey, but as a breeding ground. They grew inside the subconscious, commandeering the life of the psyche until hosts like Macy, Liam, and Trisha no longer resembled their original forms. Sojourns to this place, this gulag of sick animals, with their meaningless chants and fragile skins and reeking smells and nauseating, irreparable bodies. Bodies which, Trisha now realized with overpowering loathing and hatred for her binding skin and blood she was currently restrained in, were for propagating the truth, for saving those imprisoned in this terrible, unlivable place. The word infestation crept into her mind, and she realized how this world had tried to poison the truth, to spit on the beautiful grotesquerie, and blaspheme the one and only escape there was from this desolate waste of matter. She smiled wide and toothy, like an animal well fed and resting from a strenuous hunt and fulfilling feast. Reflecting, she ruminated on how she might, once, have called this beautiful gift of salvation insane, another lie of this world and its demons. With all of time to reshape one's mind and body, what good could sanity be?